So it buys you explanations for weather alterations, and it buys you moral virtue. It buys you a sense that you understand the most important problems in the world. I said that climate change seems to slide pretty easily into an apocalyptic vision. And one interpretation of your criticism would be, well, that's not valid. It's not valid to make it apocalyptic like that, because many other things can be made apocalyptic. But do you think that it's plausible potentially that it is easier to do that with climate change? Yeah. And I mean, it's not clear why. Maybe it's because it also involves the non-human actors in the world, and people feel additional guilt about that. So do we have a rule of thumb that's something like, well, when we're discussing practical moves forward, we don't get to extrapolate from the present apocalyptically and say that this problem is so severe that it requires an infinite amount of resources, or it morally obligates us to devote an infinite number of resources to its solution. We don't get to play that game.
That was exactly my point. So there's been a wonderful discussion between a Harvard professor who was arguing essentially that point, that global warming might be infinitely bad, so we should be spending infinitely resources on it. And a Yale economics professor, William Nordhaus, who got the Nobel Prize in climate economics, and his point was exactly to say, look, there are infinities everywhere else. You might have heard Elon Musk is worrying about the fact that AI robots will take over, will possibly take over the world. There's the possibility that nanotech will lead to gray goo taking over the entire world. There's potential lurking catastrophes in everything we do. You can't, and that was Nordhaus's point, you can't just take one and say, oh, I'm going to spend infinity over here, because you should be spending infinity on pretty much everything else. Of course, that doesn't actually compute. And so what real people do all the time is we're faced with things that have a tiny probability of going really, really badly. We spend more resources on them. We try to find more ways to tackle them smartly, but we also recognize there's no way we're going to get rid of all apocalyptic problems. We simply have to be smart about it. And in my book, I talk about how we should also be smart about climate change. If you worry about the apocalyptic prospects of global warming, the only way to fix that is by investigating, not doing, but investigating geoengineering, which is basically a way of being able to, without climate policy, be able to stabilize the planet's climate.
Right, and I don't have the feeling that geoengineering solutions are going to be an easy sell, even to people who are apocalyptically minded. And maybe it's because they envision geoengineering apocalypses. If you're going to talk to someone and you don't really know what to talk about, you'll make small talk about the weather. And so it's an immediate day-to-day concern in a way that even infectious disease isn't or wasn't before COVID. And so maybe that's another reason that the climate issue has occupied the space for apocalyptic attention. If there is a too hot summer or an extraordinarily hot summer, you have an explanation for it, and it's something that affects you while it's happening, or a too cold winter day, or too much wind, or too much rain, or any of the extreme weather events that can manifest themselves. So there's an immediacy to weather that seems to be associated perhaps with the emotional resonance of climate change that's also perhaps working against these rational arguments.
Well, there's certainly something. So we have research that shows that when it's hot, people believe more in global warming than when it's cold. So there definitely is these kinds of very simple connections. On the other hand, if you think about it, when you talk about global warming, it's going to be, let's say, 4 degrees centigrade hotter in 100 years. That's actually really hard to imagine that most people would get very worked up about. And that's, of course, also what you saw for the first 20 years or so of global warming. What has happened is that shift from the focus on the basic outcomes of global warming to these catastrophic outcomes, so that every time you see a storm, every time you see a heat wave, every time you see any kind of change in weather, people will often say, see, global warming. And there, the problem is that leads you to believe this could be the end of the world.
Right.
And that's what
Well,
I think. And that's
universal explanatory rubric and hard to, so it buys you explanations for weather alterations, and it buys you moral virtue. It buys you a sense that you understand the most important problems in the world. And it occupies that apocalyptic space. I mean, another reason that climate change might have become such a concern, because, you know, people have always believed in the apocalypse. And that's because things can go cataclysmically wrong. And maybe we have a need for a cultural representation of that. And before global warming, we had the Cold War and the battle between the United States, or the West more broadly speaking, and the Soviet Union. That was a pretty plausible apocalypse. And of course, it did garner much more attention, or maybe an amount of attention that's equal to the attention that global warming attracts now.